Hey, my name's Ira Marks, and I'm the creator of the graphic novel Shark Summer. So, Shark Summer came out about 4 years ago at the time of this recording, and I think that's a nice sweet spot of the right amount of time for me to think about the journey of this book from where I was before I got the chance to make it, to the process of making it, the trials and tribulations of that, to the release, the production, and like all the things that have happened after that. This is going to be a series of videos. The first one's going to focus on where I was before I made the book, the pitch of getting the book signed to a major publisher. The next video will focus on the story, the actual like crafting of the narrative and artistic decisions that went into that. After that, I'll do a more technical video on the production of the book, and then one more video on the release and what's happened in the couple of years since. This is a video series that I would have loved to have come across when I was looking to kind of level up my career as like a artist and author, graphic novelist, cartoonist, whatever you want to call me. So, with enough time and separation from the early stages of this, like the highs and lows of that, I think I can share with the pretty like even-keeled thought process, my whole journey. And it's not to explain to you this is how you should go about it. It's not to like criticize any of the people that have been involved along the way. I just want to put out there what it was like to do a project like this. And I think a good place to start before I get to like the actual book is to let you know where I was before I got a chance to make a graphic novel. I've been an artist all my life, like probably a lot of people watching this video, and I've always made comics. Like I've always loved narrative art. I've always drawn in service of the stories I want to tell. And maybe I didn't really set out to make comics. I mean, I love filmmaking, I love animation, I love game design. I love all the mediums that narrative can fit into. But comics has always been the sweet spot of you get a lot of control and you get to really honestly and immediately connect with an audience. So if you went to iramarks.com, my website, you would see a lot of experiments in narrative art and comics and things that are maybe not like perfectly suited for a mainstream audience. And I say that because Shark Summer as a book is with a project made with a major publisher. Therefore, like there's a lot of marketing and commercial agendas behind it that inform some of the creative process, right? But before that, I wasn't really thinking of my career in that way. In fact, I was just simply going along and making longer and longer stories, and hopefully they were more clear and easy to read and enjoyable for an audience. And through one of the Kickstarters I ran to print an edition of my webcomic, I found an agent. It wasn't really a thing I was looking for exactly, but I had somebody reach out and basically say, hey, I like your work, and I think with some fine tuning, we could pitch one of your projects to a major publisher. I'd always considered myself more of an independent creator, but I never really made a connection with any independent comic publisher. So in a way, this was like jumping to another space that I hadn't really pictured for myself. But something that you might know about major publishers is maybe the audience isn't necessarily bigger, but the money to produce something is more reliable. And I just thought that would be an interesting opportunity. And like the idea of having a book in a public library or Barnes & Noble, that was pretty appealing. As I was getting older, I just, wanted to make stories for younger readers. And I thought more about my audience than I did exactly getting out there, like the core of my emotions. That's like kind of a 20-something vibe for me. By the time I was in my 30s, I was like, well, who am I telling these stories for? So that agent kind of helped me find a direction for that work. And through a lot of trial and error, we crafted some projects that were pitches for different books. And I have lots of rejection letters to prove it. So this is like a 3 or 4 year journey of collecting rejection letters and refining my work to try to fit a more commercial space, which I thought was an interesting challenge for me after doing a lot of experimentation. And during that journey, my agent decided they weren't going to continue their career in publishing, which is fair because publishing is tough. And being an agent probably has a lot of like highs in the mix there, but I'm sure there's a lot of like struggle. And, so whatever, for whatever reason, my agent was leaving the business, which kind of left me adrift. So I didn't really have a straightforward path from here. I had a lot of rejection letters and I had some projects that were graphic novels that I was still wanting to pitch. So what I did, instead of like just, I don't know, feeling bad for myself, I started really digging into my rejection letters. And the thing about rejection letters, in their best senses, they're actually bits of advice. When an editor sees something in your work but isn't the right fit for them, they simply don't say no, pass. They say why it doesn't work for them, but also kind of point out its strengths. And sometimes they'll offer, if you're willing to maybe direct your work this way or other, maybe we can find a place for you. Because an editor, they're a creative person as well. They have their own creative project, which is their imprint, right? I end up working with Andrea Colvin at Little Brown for Shark Summer, Little Brown Ink, to be specific. Sorry, Andrea. And Andrea, has a vision of what Little Brown Ink represents, where it fits in publishing. And any publisher, any editor would have that same creative agenda. So, looking at my rejection letters, I found one from this editor, Andrea Colvin, who was just about to start Little Brown Ink. And she was like, the project you pitched isn't the right fit for me. Andrea had notes about my art style not really pairing for her perfectly with the story I wanted to tell. And I think we all hit those hurdles of like, how do our creative sides like come together to make this like more than the sum of its parts thing, right? So I liked what Andrea had to say, and I was really into some books she had published with her in her career so far. So I'm like, let me see what I can do to make something work for this person. So at this time I was pitching some sci-fi and fantasy projects. One of them was called Fishhead. It was kind of like a creature from the Black Lagoon thing meets a werewolf curse story with like a little like Lovecraft-esque vibe, but for kids. And Andrea's like, interesting, but at Little Brown Ink, what I want to do is, at this point, tell stories that were a little more contemporary, like not high fantasy set in like a Middle-earth-esque, world, but like what are stories that are happening now for like a contemporary reader. So this is a market that's really popular for middle grade and YA. I think YA gets to be a little more fantastic, but I find in this current day, like mainstream middle grade graphic novels, like graphic novels for young readers, like Smile is, one of the cornerstones of that market. They're contemporary stories. They're set in like the present day and kind of a believable, maybe with some like hyper reality around it. So that's basically what Andrea was looking for. And it was nice that she was giving me like a little extra time and energy, because she could have just been like, pass, let me move on and find somebody else. But she was like, well, maybe Ira has something to offer. So I thought about it for a while. I took all my sci-fi and fantasy and I set it aside. And, I felt at my core that's who I was and what I wanted to do. But I was like, but what if I did make a contemporary story? Like, what about the world today do I have to say for young readers? And I thought about what I loved, like what was a topic I wanted to focus on. Like middle grade stories are always about friendship, so okay, that goes unsaid, but what could I speak about? And I was like, well, I like filmmaking, I like creative process, and through most of my life, my most valuable friendships have been through creative process, whether it was bands I was in or like making comics as a kid. A lot of the community that I'm part of is through just like creative collaboration. I make friends best through art, is what I'm saying. And I thought that could be a story to tell, and I think a lot of kids could relate to that. But what industry or like what kind of art project would be well suited for a graphic novel? I'm like, well, I don't want to make a comic about kids making comics. What if they're making a movie? Okay, my brain kind of has like leans into meta aspects when I started thinking of like film making. A lot of like movies and art I like is a little meta referential. So I was like, well, what if these kids are making a movie behind the scenes of another movie? And I was like, well, what's the most popular movie that I could focus this story around that kids and adults could all like know? Like, what's the movie of American movies? And I was like, well, Jaws just has to be it. Whether you've seen Jaws or not, you get its vibe, you get its aesthetic, you know its story, you know its characters, you know its soundtrack, you know its director. Jaws was like kind of the most perfect creative project that everybody could understand to some degree. And I thought it was extra perfect because if you're a kid reading a book about Jaws, you don't necessarily know what Jaws is. And I think a lot of young people, even myself when I was young, we grew up in the shadow of the creative culture of like the last generation, right? The graphic novels I love, the art I love was influenced by artists that were influenced by other artists, right? So if I look at Jeff Smith, who created Bone, I could be like, that's a totally unique vision. But if I track that back, I can see that Jeff Smith was clearly influenced by Walt Kelly and other like iconic cartoonists of the generation before him. We all kind of like rise up, and whether we know it or not, are taking influence by the things that happened before us. So the idea of kids making their own movie, finding their own voice while Jaws is being made, something that became like so iconic and, you know, changed people's perception of like the island of Martha's Vineyard and what a blockbuster movie could be and what a horror movie could be, or, you know, a 70s film. All these things like shifted as Jaws came into being. And I was like, that's what it's like to be young and creative, is to watch the world turn around you and try to find your voice. So in short, I was like, this is my idea. Can I say on YouTube? I don't know. Anyway, so that was like the beginning of my pitch. And I give you those fine details because if I'm not trying to like sell you a copy of Shark Summer, I'm just trying to help you find your place in my creative process. Odds are you can like be nodding your head at like some of these moments because they're quieter, deeper, maybe sad, maybe like self-conscious moments of looking for the idea of what you want to say with your work. So I'm trying to give you something to relate to, and also something that's like, hey, if you're here, like, no, there's more to come after this and you're not going to be stuck in this moment forever. So I had what I felt like was a pretty good idea for a book pitch. So I wrote a little paragraph, and I think, honestly, at the end of the day, whether this is a depressing idea or not, the title Shark Summer is just really good. And weirdly enough, there wasn't a book called that yet. And like SEO, you know, Shark Week, if I have a book called Shark Summer, that's gonna like pop up right in there. So to be a little cynical, I think the title is a big part of what sold the book, and not so much my long rambling idea of like being young, creativity, and the shadow of pop culture from the generation before. The title Shark Summer is what sold that book. So I had the title, I had a little plot synopsis, and I sent that off to Andrea, and I pretended I had had it all along. I was like, oh yeah, I have this in my back pocket. I'm not making this up right now just to try to get a book deal with you. And Andrea's like, okay, let's try this. And to try that doesn't mean that she instantly gets to help me make the book. There are resources that are required for me to make this book for this publisher. So Andrea has to take that story, this idea, to a marketing meeting. So here's where we get into the crafting of the pitch. It's one thing to have like a good idea and a body of work that shows you can maybe produce something, you know, a 300-page graphic novel like Shark Summer. It's not a small book. It's 304 pages. You can't just figure out how to make that out of nothing. You have to have like a body of work that shows you could do that, right? So I had that, and now I needed to put together a pitch for the book. So if you follow me on Skillshare or like on other parts of the internet, you probably know I do online classes, and I have a class on pitching graphic novels. Someday I'll just dump the whole thing on YouTube. Maybe it's a little dated because I made it like 3 or 4 years ago, but I think it's got a lot of great tips on how to pitch a graphic novel. But basically what you need to know is a graphic novel is a collection of, you know, things a marketing team needs to see to give them the confidence and a sense of how much money it's going to cost them to help you make this book, and if spending that money is worth it for them. It's like a math game, right? That's what marketing is. It's like, how much money do we have to spend to make X amount of money? And the book, you know, the creative project is the commodity. So I had a story summary, a little like elevator pitch as to what Shark Summer was. I started doing some concept art. And at this stage, Andrea and I are still kind of working on building this pitch, because not only does the pitch have to serve what I have to say, it has to be like clear to Andrea so she can take it to this meeting and present it confidently and like win these people over. I'm not in that meeting to sell myself. I just have to sell myself to Andrea. Andrea has to take that information and sell our collaboration to her team, right? You following me on all this stuff? Hope so. So I started doing some concept art, and I'll put some of that up on the screen here now. And you can see, like, when I showed you the cover of the book, this early concept art doesn't quite resemble it. I guess I didn't quite understand what middle grade graphic novels were. In a way, it's kind of an emerging space still. Like, I think it's kind of locked in some of its aesthetics. But when I was growing up, like, for example, Bone by Jeff Smith, again, put out by Scholastic's imprint graphics, that was really the first middle grade graphic novel. Like 20 some odd years ago, Bone was simply an independent comic that I would find every other month in my comic shop. And I literally grew up reading Bone. From middle grade through college, Jeff Smith was releasing an issue of Bone every other month. So I feel like I was just like watching him write this story in real time and just like almost seeing him draw on the paper. And I think that was a very special feeling and really connected me with that project. And I was always surprised that it became a thing that was in public libraries. I mean, I wasn't surprised. It's like a very digestible, like cartoon, high adventure, Tolkien-esque, Mickey Mouse looking type of comic. Like, it makes sense that kids would find it appealing, but I never thought of it as a kid's project. I just thought of it as an interesting art project. But it came to define a market. And then later, I would say again, Raina Telgemeier kind of rebuilt that space around the idea of like the contemporary story of friendship. Like Babysitter's Club is probably more of a reference for what middle grade looks like these days. And I was much more of a Bone person, like the weird idea of like mashing up your aesthetics and storytelling to find like a totally new thing. So I was still figuring out what my look would be for making like a mainstream middle grade graphic novel. So Andrea asked me to take another crack at the art. So I did, and eventually I arrived at what would I say is more of a Scooby-Doo-ification of my art style. Like it's a little more shape languagey, squash and stretchy, really like bold colors and kind of the Cartoon Network-esque spirit of like, here are our color identities and here's like our emotions full force in the faces. I really got good at drawing eyebrows while working on Shark Summer. So I started learning new skills that became like very valuable and I became very good at, because I started realizing my sort of vibe wasn't as important as my emotional narrative skills for a project like this. So I set aside some of the tools I was even using. At that point, I was still like playing in pen and ink, watercolor, a lot of traditional tools. But now it was time to kind of hit some tighter deadlines and make the money of a advance work for me. And digital just was the solution. So I had also swapped over to a drawing tablet, right? A big I don't remember what brand I was using for a while. Now I have a Cintiq, like the expensive one, but for a long time I had a cheaper drawing tablet, and it was working fine. But of course I had to kind of rebuild my visual identity on it. If you've ever switched from traditional tools to a digital surface, suddenly you're like adrift, like, how do I draw? How do I color? Like, how do I use texture? Why I have so many brush options now. It's very overwhelming. So I was having a bit of an identity crisis, but luckily I landed on a style that I felt was like true to me and really worked for this story, which was a little dark. Like, the feeling of watching Jaws is it's an adventure story, kind of, I guess about masculinity. It's kind of a Moby Dick-esque adventure with some horror elements. Like the genre feels like dipped in horror, even though it's kind of a PG adventure movie. But there's a lot of like jump scares. There's a lot of cinematography that implies like Hitchcock thriller. And then there's also this supernatural monster that haunts one character's like nightmares and also asks another character to become like hero, the last standing hero, right? It's a bunch of genres, Shark or Jaws. So I wanted to like dip into all of those. So my art style was able to like play off these cinematic techniques and genre framing techniques and narrative things. So anyway, that's why the book looks like what it looks like. So from there, Andrea brings the project to a marketing meeting, and this is the point where your work can be as good as it is. I mean, you can always get better at art, and you can keep getting better for the whole length of your life. But getting better at art does not necessarily improve your chances of having a successful career in art. Because as soon as you step into a commercial space, you're jumping onto another track where people need to see you as a commodity. They need to make money off your creative visions. And there's just always some compromise there, right? So I made something that was working for this market. And it took some changes in myself to get there. But I wanted to tap into a new audience. So that's how I arrived there. And, you know, from there, the timing was just right, where I don't necessarily think a year later Andrea would have maybe signed Shark Summer. It just happened that she was starting this imprint, had X amount of money, had X amount of freedom, and was like, you know, let me do this kind of meta-textual Scooby-Doo mystery set behind the scenes of Jaws, which we started calling Shark because we didn't want to, you know, we can't just infringe on intellectual property like Jaws. So we called it Shark as like the reference for the book. And anyway, timing is what I'm getting at here. So I'd like to point that out because I think it's very easy to feel like if you're pitching a book and you get a rejection letter, like, you know, someone passes on your work, it feels like it's not good enough and you need to get better. But it's like, maybe you don't need to get better. Maybe you just need to keep throwing things out there and hope to God that you timed it just right. I guarantee you could ask Andrea right now and she would be like, if I wrote me an email about Shark Summer the next day, like the Wednesday instead of the Tuesday, I might have just been like, good luck with this project. Like, it's not for me. So nothing is inevitable. It's not like you were always meant to like make the thing, or you were always going to be famous, or you were always going to not be a famous artist. It's just about timing. And all you can do is keep trying to hit the timing for certain things. So the timing was right for me at this point. So lucky me. And hopefully lucky you someday, if not already. So from there, we enter into kind of like another stage. So I was offered in advance. It was not spectacular, but I wanted this opportunity. And I think a lot of publishing rides on the romanticism of what it means to be like a tangible thing. Like, you know, I love the internet. I love digital spaces as much as, maybe not as much as anybody, but I love them enough and I respect them. I don't think like books are better than websites or webcomics or whatever. But for me, like, there's something magical about getting the opportunity to make a book and having companies support that, like help you get it out into the world. I've done my share of self-publishing and I do my share of marketing because that's just the reality of being an independent creator. But it's exhausting, and finding a chance to have somebody help me promote something, give it a little more legitimacy to like a school librarian. I was like, what could happen for me if I get this door open for myself? So that was like a big, exciting thing. And I was willing to take like a small amount of money to make the book. So all that is to say, a book advance probably will not pay for your ambitions. If you can learn to balance that. I find that a lot of my favorite books, and probably this is something similar for you, are an artist's first work because it's the culmination of all the things they've been waiting to say. And this was finally an outlet that they felt like they could get all that stuff into a space. You know, maybe it's your own personal memoir story, or maybe it's just the weirdest idea anyone's ever had that finally got out into the world, but you've been like crafting it for years. So it's just like this Cronenberg-esque monster that's like perfect for the time and place of the modern world. Whatever you get to make in that first immediate moment, you know, I've made many things before Shark Summer, but this was like an opportunity to speak to a bigger audience. So I wanted to fit a lot in there. And my ambitions were way higher than the amount of money. Like, I was being paid to make a book much shorter, much less ambitious, much less specific. Like take 30%, if you've ever read Shark Summer, take 30% of that story and its layers and like artistic craft. And that's what I got paid for, 30% of it, I would say. And I don't regret the choices I made to be more ambitious. I might regret going forward some of the future projects. I tried to level up my ambition, and it got a little unsustainable monetarily. But at this moment, it was a gamble. Like when you make a project like this and you accept in advance, it's almost like you're creating your own weird little stock market. I don't know anything about the stock market, but like this is a commodity I built, and like I hope someday it'll become worth more than it is in that room for the publisher right now. Like they're like, this thing's probably worth X amount of money. That's a real safe bet. So we'll take that amount and give this author a fraction of that to produce the book. Those people in the room have never made a graphic novel. They have never framed a panel. They've never like taught themselves line art. They've never like studied color theory in a narrative form. I mean, maybe they have. Maybe not. Like, have they drawn a speech bubble? Have they paced dialogue? Have they like revised narration? Have they written 18 drafts of a script? Have they drawn 40 pages of a book and threw it out because it took you 40 pages to figure out how to draw your character and now you're starting over? You know what I'm talking about. There's a million steps in that iceberg below the surface that a marketing team doesn't understand, and they're not going to pay you for that time. That's the magic of art, is like, through the grace of like a creative vision and the belief that people will enjoy the potential of this in all its like strange, weird obsessions, like that's the magic of art. It's not like a rational decision made at a table. And that requires like the sacrifice of the artist, right? Maybe some of us get rich, but that's a very small amount. And it really has nothing to do in a lot of ways with our creative ambitions. It has more to do with like the sustainability and rationalization. So all that said, as I began to work on this project, I started to think about all these things, and they wormed their way into the story. So slowly Shark Summer became about the fine-tuning of making a project, wanting to get something out of that financially. Like in Shark Summer, the plot basically revolves around this young protagonist, Gail, who begins the story as like a softball all-star athlete. She's a great pitcher. She breaks her arm in the first couple pages because I wanted Gail to be kind of a blank slate. I wanted to take her identity, and I think for a lot of young people, sports is like a really easy early stage of finding identity, other than art for me, sports. So if I took her sport identity away, what did she have? So Gail's like adrift for the summer. What does she want to do? She decides she wants to help her mom open an ice cream shop on the island of Martha's Vineyard. So this is like Gail getting a little insight into what her mom wants to do with her life. But they don't have enough money to do this. So Gail's mom continues to work her jobs around the island while dreaming of opening this ice cream shop. And because this big blockbuster movie is being filmed on the island of Martha's Vineyard, the studio is running a film festival, and they're offering a prize for like best film. So Gail's like, oh, I'll just win that prize money. I'm good at stuff. But of course, she is stepping into a space she doesn't understand, this realm of like narrative art and what are its values. They're very different than in a sports realm, right? So this idea, this stepping into a new creative space, became what the book was about. So the journey of Gail, in the way like Harry Potter is a blank slate when he goes to Hogwarts, that's how you, the reader, get to know the world of, the magical world, or like Bilbo, right? Like you learn Middle Earth through a character who's experiencing it for the first time. So Gail was that for me. She was experiencing the creative journey of narrative art. So she has a vision of making a project, and she gains friends that kind of fill these other roles. So she meets Elijah, who is the cinematographer, and he's kind of the more technically minded, resource privileged character who is like the side of you that's always kind of a struggle. Like being creative requires resources. Resources are a luxury not all of us can afford. If I wanted to be a filmmaker, I would have had to move to a bigger city. I would have needed to buy a nicer camera or gone to a different college, like made network connections in industry cities. That's like the cost of trying to move into a creative space like that. Comics doesn't really work like that because you can really just make them in any room if you have paper and a pencil and a good idea and like motivation. You can make an award-winning comic and build a comic career on very few tools. And I think that is very valuable. Well, all that said, I did say I was going to focus on the pitch of the graphic novel. So this is a thing I've taught about online because for me, I couldn't find any real solid reference points in 2021 about how to put together a good graphic novel pitch. Like I said, this is still like, an emerging market. 20 years might feel like a long time, but 20 years in publishing is not. And for example, like when I went to sign my first contract for Shark Summer, the contract looked like it was designed, the boilerplate, like the template of the contract before any like agents came in and helped do some rewording. The template, the boilerplate looked like it was for a prose novel. Like it wasn't looking at me as a graphic novelist and all those processes that entails. It was basically like, hi, we want to release your book. Your book is full of content. Whatever it took to make that content, besides the fact, but here's how much money we're going to give you for it. You can't really compare crafting a prose novel to a graphic novel. They're just two totally different animals. Like, for example, a prose novel is written in a Word document and simply moves down the page and jumps to the next page when it's hits the bottom, right? Graphic novels don't work like that. You craft the literal book. You decide what happens when you turn the page in a very early stage of the process. That is effort and work that, isn't always being acknowledged. So I don't know why I went on that tangent exactly, but my point is I want to help you make the best pitch you can and prepare yourself for a scenario where you're going to be like able to be kind to yourself with the amount of work you're putting into this and what you're actually getting from a publisher to do that work. Hopefully this isn't draining like the artistic ambition out of you. Like, please just turn this video off and go make something weird just for fun because you love it. Make your grandmother a birthday card because you know how to draw. Draw a picture of somebody's cat and give it to them just because. Make stuff to be nice and for yourself. But right now we're going to get into like some of the like technical stuff of pitching a graphic novel. So, you want to make this a career, like here's things you got to think about. So what actually is the pitch? The pitch, I said, is like these 4 parts. It's a story summary, it's character sheets, it's sample art, and it's like a deeper plot synopsis. All this stuff is designed to give confidence to editor and their marketing team that you can get this job done. Like you actually understand the journey that it takes to make a long form narrative in the medium of graphic novels, and you're going to get it done and not inconvenience these people. Something you got to think about, and this happened to me, sometimes your work aligns just right with the market. Like you may have always been like drawing in a YA style and then you get a book deal for a YA book and you just continue working that way. For me, it wasn't quite that straightforward. I had to kind of adapt to a middle grade market. And I think when artists pitch, like say a TV show, like if you were a fan of say like Johann Vasquez and you grew up like me in the 90s reading Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, if you grew up reading his weird comics and then watched Invader Zim, so where does your book fit in the market? That's a question. And do your research. Read lots of books, of course, but look at who is putting out these books. There's like 5 big publishers and they all have imprints within them. Like I mentioned, Scholastic, that's a big publisher. The imprint Graphics is part of Scholastic, and that's where they focus their graphic novel work. First Second is another one. So I work for Little Brown Ink with these projects I'm describing. Shark Summer is a Little Brown Ink book. Little Brown is the bigger company, one of America's oldest publishers, which is no longer an independent thing. It's now owned by Hachette, which is like a bigger conglomerate thing. So all these companies, the money runs downhill to these systems, right? So really, like, who am I selling this book to? I'm selling it to like a bigger publishing house that's almost like invisibly large over this small like branding of the imprint. So do your research, like look back through these steps, see what editors and publishers are working with certain projects, and see what you might pair well with. I happen to pair well with Andrea, and when, no surprise, maybe like we get along very well and we can socialize well because we have similar points of reference, we have similar like senses of humor. So it's maybe not a coincidence that she put out a book I made because she can appreciate the tone of my work because it matches a tone she enjoys in the world, right? So find the people that are the right fit. You don't want to just pitch a book to anybody and everybody because it's like going, to a party. You can't just talk to everybody. Like find your people who's going to want to like engage with you in a conversation. That's what you're looking for with your pitch. So it's a personal statement, but it's also trying to communicate something to somebody that's going to understand it. So you want to focus the work a little in that way. Let's see, I'm actually looking at one of my slideshows for pitching right now. What else? Let's move this up here so my eye line doesn't keep shifting. All right. This market of middle grade, it's only one of like a million little niches. Like when I was a kid and I went to the library, this is like mid-early 90s, I ended up reading a lot of Stephen King and books that were definitely for adults because there was no market for me. There was children's books, like there were picture books, and maybe there was like a comic or two. There was like Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is just a Pulitzer Prize winning like masterpiece. It's not like a kid's book, but it was like one of the few comics at the library. So my point is, the idea of a space for younger readers has been growing over the years, right? A book that was for younger readers in the 70s doesn't necessarily mean the same thing it does now. So now the market of graphic novels for young readers from like say like 5 to 19, it's very specific. Like an early reader graphic novel is different than a middle grade graphic novel, is different than a YA graphic novel. So it's actually pretty interesting to watch the art form suit certain spaces. So like if you're an early reader graphic novel, you have less panels per page. You have like simpler, blunt speech bubbles. Your characters don't have like an interior life as much on the page. Everything they do is like big and bold and exterior. Middle grade is focused on like identity and finding early friendships. Where does romance come into play? Like sexuality, like things like this. That's when you get into YA. So it's like the idea of a kiss. You could have a kiss in a middle grade graphic novel maybe, but it could probably only be one. It would be like very light. If you want like kissing, like meaningful kissing or like erotic scenes, then you're moving into YA. Like there's some ideas that don't fit in every space. There's some tones of storytelling that don't fit for a marketing team in these spaces. Yes, go on Kickstarter and like make your own weird, I guess, middle grade romance. I don't know. Blend all your shit together, but it doesn't necessarily mean major publishing understands that. So that's kind of like what I'm speaking to, this idea of like the restrictions of major publishing. There's just rules. There's like a conservativeness to it that doesn't allow for things to go certain directions. And I could summarize this general idea by an aspect of like the Shark Summer pitch I was working on. So here's some sample pages I made for Shark Summer. Sample pages are simply a look at the aesthetic the artist envisions. They might not be pages that really appear in a book, but they're pages that are drawn out, paneled versions of scenes from your story, drawn in the art style you're going to be working in. So it can give somebody who doesn't really know your work that well idea of what it would be to read this book. So I wanted a scene in my book where the protagonists of the story, the kids, go behind the scenes of Jaws, and they actually go to what's called Shark City, which was a warehouse on the island of Martha's Vineyard where Jaws was being filmed, where a lot of the props were kept and a lot of the creative process that is the behind the scenes of Jaws was being done. So they walk into this big warehouse. It's kind of dingy. There's like, you know, turpentine here in the foreground and like the big rig that's holding up the pneumatic Bruce the Shark robot shark that's in the movie. But also there's a severed head prop, because that's, to me, an iconic scene in Jaws where this like severed head pops up out of the water and scares Richard Dreyfuss. So I drew the severed head because I was like, this will be cool. It's kind of like grimy, weird, like that's a good middle grade vibe. Kids like creepy, weird grossness. But when I presented those sample pages, Andrew's like, this isn't quite working. It's almost like too grimy. It feels too real. I had to cartoonify it, kind of was the idea. So I didn't remove the idea. I think a big lesson in working with an editor is an editor isn't there to shut your ideas down and change your story. They're there because they care about your story and they want to clarify it and make it suit their market. So they're trying to find this balance of authenticity, but also like visual clarity for your work. So the idea of the severed head, it wasn't that I couldn't use it because it was too gross. It was more how I was presenting it, right? And the way you could describe something with a lot of detail, and at some point it becomes unappealing. But if you step back and broaden the detail, or you like lighten the touch on the detail, you might make it a little more palatable. So in short, I redrew that severed head and it worked okay. And that was like a huge lesson in this pitching process. You know, I have certain things I want to say with my work. I wanted to speak to the idea of growing up with complicated stories that were bigger than your brain was ready for, stories that spoke to like the history of storytelling. I don't want to make a book that's self-contained. I want to like expand and challenge and like maybe scare a young reader, because I think that is the journey of becoming literate, is being curious about where this like visual language can take you. So, you know, I want to layer in complicated ideas about identity, about creative process, about the history of Martha's Vineyard, about reckoning with the responsibility of storytelling. I want all this stuff in my work, but if I can present it with a lighter touch, if I know where to put the joke, or if I know how to use a shading that softens like the textures of this object, it makes like an easier entry point for the reader. And I think that's a technical skill I didn't know I was looking for until I discovered in this pitching process. Watching people and hearing them respond to like minutia in your art because they have something at stake, that's not an opportunity you always get, right? If you do a cool drawing and post it on your social media, your followers are probably going to think it's cool, because what are the stakes for them? They like you, they want to like what you do, and they appreciate the effort you put in. So thumbs up, cool comment. But when someone's trying to like make something for themselves through your work, like an editor or a publisher, that's a really interesting, unique conversation you only get when you're crafting a pitch. So I was discovering these weird little steps of choice making in my creative journey that I just didn't really have space for before. They were invisible to me. So all that said, again, look at how other artists have crafted their work. Like take a graphic novel that you love and go do some research on that artist. See how their work has evolved. You know, evolved is just a journey, like not like it's better necessarily, but it's like shifted and changed as they've built their career, maybe around the success of something or around the failure of something. Understand that the journey is the journey. There is no end point. Like me signing the contract for Shark Summer, it's not the resolution of anything. Shark Summer selling like fairly well, or me getting like a New York Times review, that's not the resolution of anything. Those are just like things along the way. Some of those things are smoother than others. Some of those things open up new choices. Some of them send you on a different path altogether. Who knows? But seeing that in other artists' work is something that I was able to do as I was working on this pitch. So there are other values in pitching that aren't just simply like, am I going to get a contract through this document? Is this thing worth that alone. I think it's actually like a creative opportunity as well. A pitch is like its own art project. So again, explore the market, explore what other artists have done, do your due diligence, right? Like study art, and that'll all help you gain more confidence in what you have to say and better envision what your approach should be to things like this. So what else can I tell you about pitching? Be very concise. As an educator, I see a lot of pitches, or I see a lot of like early stages of creative projects from people, and I think a lesson you need to learn is not everybody that wants to engage with your work needs to know all of the iceberg below the surface. I mean, we're like 40 minutes into this video right now, so maybe you do want to know all the parts of the iceberg below the surface here. But like if I was just telling you the world building I'd done for a fantasy land I created, you'd probably hit a wall where you're like, can we just follow the emotional journey of these characters? I don't need to know like all the socioeconomic stakes of like this small city. That is to say, when you're building a story, you do so much work behind the scenes that doesn't need to be presented on the platter to your editor. It doesn't need to be part of the pitch. Be concise, be clear. Tell us the emotional arc of your main character when you go to present something for the first time. That's what we care about. We care about like the point of view of the story, not necessarily like taking in the whole world at once. We don't need to know what year it is even. When I was working on Shark Summer, it was very important to me that it was the summer of 1974, because that's the summer Jaws was being filmed on Martha's Vineyard. But an early note I got was that let's not mention the year, because for one, a contemporary reader, like a kid, doesn't care about the abstract concept of 1974 as a time and place on an island of Martha's Vineyard, a place they've probably never been, about a movie they may have never seen. It's set in an ambiguous past that is reflective of the contemporary times, but it uses like the aesthetics of the past to kind of move the plot along, right? So be unspecific about your world building, but be hyper-specific about the emotional journey of your characters. And the only way to arrive at a strong emotional journey is to do a lot of that world building. Okay? So that's really what your pitch is kind of focusing on. Like, what are we looking at? Why are we looking at it right now? Why does this story need to be told, right? If my character Gail has lived, 12 years of her life at this point, why is Shark Summer the important moment to tell? That title, it's catchy, but also describes like a hyper-specific moment in time. And I think there's a big appeal in storytelling in that. Like, think of how many stories you enjoy that are about a length of time, right? Like Lord of the Rings, I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I think like Lord of the Rings is a year or two, a there and back again journey. Like, Frodo's journey isn't that much time, though the world feels immense and infinite. But the journey is fairly short in the context of that, or like in the context of, Gandalf's lived a lot of years, but this is like the moment in time that was like most valuable for him. So who's your point of view, and why is this the moment? If you don't know what your moment is yet, but you know what your world is, I don't know if you're ready to pitch that project, because you might have something unwieldy in your hands. Like, this isn't like Shark Year or Shark World. It's like Shark Summer. Maybe even more refined version would be Shark Day. Like, I've played with time in my stories. Like, sometimes I think it's a great restriction. So consider that when you're building your story. Get hyper-focused on moments. A graphic novel is a series of moments. What is the kind of range of these moments? All right, from there, you've got this like hyper-specific story and point of view and characters that are like engaging and emotionally interesting. Then you can kind of build out the mechanics of your plot. The ideas of like, because this happened, then this happened. The chain reaction that makes this character's emotional journey make sense. The pieces, the steps along the way. It can't be because of this and this, because that's not emotionality, right? Emotionality is about response. Like, acting is about reacting. If your characters are actors, they need to like respond to the world. So like in my story, Gail is happy as a pitcher, but she breaks her arm. Now she has a loss of purpose, but her mom could use her help. Because of that, Gail decides she can exert some of her energy towards her mom, and that might make her happy again. Suddenly we have like a journey for this character. But you see the chain of events? It's not like one day Gail woke up and she hurt her arm, and then her mom like said, why don't you help me for this? Those are like coincidences. Like stories are rooted in coincidence a lot. Sometimes that's just, you need a coincidence to like make a story happen. But after that, you need an emotional chain reaction to have your character like physically bouncing off ideas. In the world of cartoon art, you know, like if you study like old Disney cartoons, there's a book called The Illusion of Life. The idea that we can use a drawing to evoke an emotion in an audience, right? Like that a thing can feel believable. How do they do that? It responds to the world. A ball squishes when it hits a surface and like stretches when it returns. That shows engagement in space. Faces squashing and stretching show emotional engagement. When you go back and watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, turn off the sound, and here's why that movie is a masterpiece. It's a study in cartoon emotions. And here in America, that was like one of the first times an audience had experienced that. And I think about that a lot when I'm making this type of art, when I'm making narrative art for young readers. I think about the squash and stretch of the face, the emotional core that is eyebrows, eyes, and mouth. I've got Skillshare classes talking about that for days. That is like the essence. And I bring that stuff up because I think when you're crafting a pitch and you're looking for the visual aesthetic, how you draw, how that drawing is going to be sustainable for 300 pages, you know, you're really not drawing at your full capacity. It's like running a marathon. You can't just sprint the whole way. You will never complete the engagement. So graphic novels need to be drawn in almost like a way that reserves energy. So what do you focus on? If you can't add every single detail that you feel like needs to be there to make the image communicate, where should you focus? I think aspects of the face, the narrative components, eyebrows, eyes, and mouth, they change as a character engages with the world. They tell the reader what the character's thinking. And it can help the setting of your character be more engaging for the reader. So like if I'm my character and I look over here and I go, that tells you, the reader, how to respond to the thing I'm looking at. It doesn't need to, the thing I'm looking at doesn't need to be that well drawn because the face is telling you how you're supposed to respond to that. So knowing that a reader is going to look to your character's face for a lot of engagement, that's the core to your story. And when I was doing my sample pages, you can see me prioritizing that. I picked scenes that are about characters finding that Spielbergian sense of awe and wonder as they walk into this Shark City warehouse. And then I jump to later in the story and I have sample pages that show kind of the culmination of the idea of friendship these characters have built. Like they're kind of in a very rocky moment where they're kind of like finally coming to terms with what they need out of this situation, and it's at odds with what their friendship is and what other people need. So it's an emotional, dramatic dynamic going on, and I'm doing my best to like explore that through the characters' faces and their body language. Notice there's not a lot of visual detail in the backgrounds. So setting is part of what characters respond to, but if they're responding, you don't need to draw as much of the setting. So consider that when you're building your pitch and your story. If you want to make a book about let's say a basketball game, it's hard to draw basketball, let alone a basketball court, let alone a stadium, let alone a team, let alone like the logo on the jersey. That's a lot of like research and effort that can feel very heavy. But if you know that the face does a lot of the storytelling, it actually can lighten the load for you there. Well, just because I like to quote Ursula K. Le Guin whenever possible, this is a slide from my presentation that maybe can help you think about your plotting and, you know, where you are with your storytelling. Essential book for narrative artists, Steering the Craft, 21st Century Guide to Sailing the Sea of Story by Ursula K. Le Guin. Here's a great quote from it. Most serious modern fictions can't be reduced to a plot retold without fatal loss except in their own words. The story is not in the plot, but in the telling. It is the telling that moves. I think that is essential to know, because the truth is your voice is what is interesting about you. And you can't really change that, essentially. Like, I can tell you that I've been molded, I guess, by my creative experience in developing the pitch up to this point, but I still sound like what I sounded like before that. I can't auto-tune my voice beyond what it already does. It's always looking for the same things when I sit down to draw something. And if you can wrap your arms around that and present that in like a beautiful, clear, somewhat simple package, that's how you're going to endear an audience to you, whether it's an editor or like readers. Like, that's the magic of the graphic novel, is that mark you make on the page, that is your own words. Like, that is your tone. That is the telling of the story. So having a good hook like Shark Summer, maybe was a big part, and I can give a lot of credit to that, stumbling on that idea for my work. But the way I told the story is what will give the project legs, right? Having an editor that understood that, and the fact that, the book still sells. It didn't like disappear after people read it. It is being passed around to some degree. And that's all stuff I learned in the pitch, I think. So anyway, we should probably wrap this up here for now. And I'm going to open another chapter of this process by digging into the development of the story and telling the story of, Shark Summer, my graphic novel, over the course of 304 pages. If you like how I talk about creative process, some links below will direct you towards my online classes, which are all focused on narrative art. They're mostly like project driven, but they also have elements of like dives into art history or like philosophical ideas, like why do we like to draw in the first place type of stuff. So you can check out some of my classes there, and I'll see you next time. Okay.